Okay, everyone, so we're here at topic 9.7. We're nearly to the end. Today we're going to talk about resistance to globalization. So, our essential question is going to be what were the different reasons and responses to globalization after 1900? So, as far as historical development goes, and I'll push myself out of the way a little bit here. I guess I go here. Okay. Responses to the rising culture and economic globalization took a variety of forms. There's going to be a lot of people who, over time will not be happy with this new globalization trend. And so some of the movements we'll talk about today and how they manifested into real life events. So you can't talk about the anti-globalization movement without really talking about what happened in Seattle in 1999. In 1999, Seattle was the location of the WTO, that's the World Trade Organization's conference, to negotiate these new terms for a new millennium of free trade agreements that would affect all members of the WTO. So, what led it to happening here is that you have roughly 40,000 protesters arrive in Seattle to, protest against the WTO. And it was a broad spectrum of the people who had showed up. It's not one organized group that's showing up. It's a lot of different groups that are showing up and voicing their displeasure about the WTO and some of the policies that they had put in place in the past. And so they wanted to make sure their voices were heard. And so farmers who were affected by free trade agreements, environmentalists who saw how globalization could have an impact on the environment. You had different student groups show up. And so it's a broad spectrum of different groups. As the protests continue to go on, they eventually do turn violent, and police would use aggressive tactics to try to break up the demonstrations, including the use of tear gas and having riot police out there and making arrests for demonstrators who were not allowed to be in certain parts of the city or whatever it was. But the whole thing is a beginning point. Marx as a beginning point to the anti-globalization movement, and so that is something that continues still into the world today. There's a lot of different movements that are in the wake of this whole anti-globalization trend, or that is occurring. So you have groups that are very much against the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so these IMF and World Bank activism, takes its form in many ways. And a lot of these criticisms, and I'll talk a little bit about that in 9.8, of these two organizations is they're both giving money to developing countries, but there's a complaint that the money itself is given that puts these countries into further debt they're unable to pay, and that the money they're given is for infrastructure projects that are more beneficial to the rich. So it's in a way, it's almost like a neo-imperialism movement, and helping these countries build roads and rail lines, whatever, through the loans that are given through these organizations, is ultimately just to benefit the wealthy so they can extract resources from those countries. And so that's something that these anti-movements would argue about why these organizations are bad, and it makes those countries indebted to wealthier nations as a result, which makes it hard for them to create their own sustainable development as a result. And there's a lot of other reasons for this anti-globalization movement, and they come from both the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the political spectrum. One thing complaint is, the working conditions that are created by globalization. We talked about in the previous lectures how there are corporations that will, make the intellectual property in one country, but they would outsource the manufacturing means to another country that has cheaper labor available to them, and so many people complain of this anti-global movement that they're exploiting the fact that these countries don't protect their workers and workers' rights like other more developed countries would. But there's also outsourcing, offshoring. Is another thing that ends up being a big topic point of conversation about globalization, where where countries like the United States, a lot of our manufacturing is moved overseas to Asian countries as well as to Latin American countries. And that causes economic anxiety for people in the States, which had good paying manufacturing jobs. Those jobs are going elsewhere because it's cheaper to manufacture elsewhere and then ship them overseas. And so a lot of people are anti-globalists for that. Child labor still exists and happens in some of these countries that they're manufacturing long hours, smaller wages. The environmental damage, which we talked about in 9.2, or was it 9.3? 9.3. And then, of course, the threats to national sovereignty is another one of the big movements that's seen more recently of the anti-globalization. It's that idea that they're losing their national identity. So this leads to xenophobic behavior, anti-immigration movements. So some examples of that would be Brexit, which the British or the United Kingdom exits the European Union, and that was fueled by a lot of different things, money and other things. But it was also in part an anti-immigration movement where people saw, because of the open borders of the European Union, people from other poorer European Union countries would move to places like the United Kingdom and take up jobs, which then made it competition for work with immigrants much more heavy, and there's a pushback to that. The America First movement that Donald Trump had, campaigned on and governed by, also was rooted into an anti-globalism movement. The immigration thing is one thing, but it was also that many people voted for Trump because of the idea that of offshoring and outsourcing jobs did affect a lot of people, and especially those Midwestern states. Because of that economic anxiety, they turned to Trump, who was anti-globalization, anti-free trade agreements with more countries, and so that's something that plays a role in this whole anti-globalization movement. The goals of anti-globalists are different across the political spectrum, but to sum them up real simply, it's about human rights, it's about fair trade, it's about creating sustainable development, which they argue that globalization does not do that. It just strips resources from one part to give to the other part of the world. And then, of course, debt relief and restructuring. We talk about the IMF and the World Bank as giving loans to countries that cannot afford them sometimes, and so that's something that they're very much against. They want to restructure those countries' debt so that they can create more sustainable growth for their economies without having to suffer. A lot of their money be able to have to go pay off their debts themselves. A lot of the anti-globalist movement is going to be perpetuated through social media like Twitter, Twitter being probably the most impactful one. But this ends up leading to the development of more social medias that are local. In China, Twitter is banned, and so they have Weibo now in China, which is very much controlled by the Chinese government, and it stomps out any dissent towards globalization and anything that would be considered anti-communist rule over China. And so that's something that is briefly mentioned in the curriculum, and it's worth mentioning to you all. But that is the short of it, the whole different responses to globalization. And so here's your essential question. Make sure you respond to it. And I'll see you for 9.8, which will be our last topic this year that we're going to cover for AP World. So this is Mr. Henry signing off.